Hello, my name is Richard Usher. I joined the Royal Navy in UK in 1960. I left the Royal Navy in 1970 and joined the Royal Australian Navy, and I served in the Royal Australian Navy until 1990. Yes, the Navy is in my blood, or the sea at least. My grandfather was in the Navy in the First World War, and he was a submariner in the First World War. He served in the K-boats, and my father joined the Navy before the Second World War, and he went into submarines as well. Yes, well, when I joined the Royal Navy, I was interested in radar, and so that brought me into the operations area of the Navy, and that I continued. So that after I became an officer, I trained as a fighter controller, telling fighter aircraft where to go to intercept a target coming into to attack the fleet. And that was my specialisation. It was a very interesting area of above-water warfare. But we used to look at radar screens, and there was a little blip of an aircraft on a radar screen, and you would tell that blip where to go to intercept an incoming blip. And it was a question of hand-eye coordination, and I really enjoyed the work. It was good fun. I married my wife. We met in Sydney, and I was serving in the Royal Naval Carrier, HMS Hermes, and Bronwyn was teaching in Sydney, and her cousin is a naval nurse, and there was a party at HMAS Penguin in Sydney, and her cousin had phoned her up and said, "We need as many girls as we can get because we've got this boatload of POMs," or something like that. It was actually a ship, but never mind, she called it a boat. She wrote in her diary that night, "Not my type." Well, here we are 50 years later and we're still married. Yes, well, we used to deploy more often than not for 3 or 4 months at a time, although my longest period away from home was 6 months. And this was a time, of course, before families were supported in the way they are today, so that when we went away, our wives and children were left on their own. And it was a time, certainly in the early 70s in Australia, we had a large number of postal strikes. And there was no email in those days. Telephone communication was incredibly expensive, no mobile phones, no Skype or Zoom or any of those conference facilities that exist today. So we were reliant on letters, and our wives left behind were reliant on themselves, and they set up their own camaraderie networks, which was really interesting for them, and many of those networks with our wives have continued today. And one of the ways we communicated, and I communicated with the children when they were old enough to speak, was through little cassette tapes. And we would send cassette tapes to each other. And I'd sit in my cabin sometimes and listen to the tape that I'd just received 5 or 6 times. Well, it was all sorts of little bits and pieces that they had been doing, drawings they had done, what they'd done at school, what they'd done at Cubs or Brownies when they were old enough to get that far. Just sort of the everyday thing that happened at home. Sometimes a meal that they'd had, or if they'd been somewhere, or met one of our friends, or had an ice cream, or patted the cat, whatever it was. It was just those little things, and those little things meant so much. So they made me feel very connected with my family at home. Well, I did. I missed out on the birth of 2 of my children. Yeah, it was tough on me, but tougher on my wife. Fortunately, her mother, who lived in Perth, went over to Sydney to be with her on both occasions and provide support, and the second time around to look after the other 2 children, of course. I couldn't have done the job I did as well as I did, I think, without the support of my wife. Yes, I think we do form an affinity with the ships that we serve in. I served in HMAS Melbourne, the aircraft carrier. Fortunately, not at a time of any of the disasters that took place with the ship. Melbourne was an interesting ship. We had a complement of aircraft on board, A4 jets, the S2, which were anti-submarine aircraft, and helicopters. We had a ship's company of over 1,000, and I maintain a lot of friendships that I got from those days. One of the most interesting things that we did in HMAS Melbourne was that a friend of mine, Paul Boddington, and I put together the Melbourne Mirror newspaper. It was published every Sunday morning while we were at sea, and it contained all sorts of little interesting things. A young lady on page 3, we tried to do that, and we would have some sporting news at the end, and we'd put the latest AFL scores or racing tips or whatever into the paper as well. And of course it was in the old days of a Gestetner machine, so we had to roll it off on a Gestetner machine. But it was one of these things where you had to sort of do a skin and then ink that up and then roll it off on a great big machine to duplicate the paper. But we did that for about 3 years, I think. We put that newspaper together and it was a lot of fun. And Paul and I have maintained our friendship ever since, and our wives have too. I have some wonderful memories. We were actually in Sydney Harbour on the day that the Opera House was opened, and we were right there, and the fireworks display that night was something which was amazing for 1973 when the Opera House was opened, and we all went down to the ship that afternoon and had a bit of a party, and we went up onto the flight deck and stood on the flight deck and watched the fireworks that were taking place literally 100 yards from us. It was the most incredible experience. There were some other times coming across the Great Australian Bight. It was a very severe storm. I think one of the aircraft was washed over the side, broke its lashings and fell over the side, unfortunately, during that storm and was lost. There was some damage done to the bow of the ship because it was coming up and down. Waves were coming over the top of the flight deck at some stage, so that it was quite a severe storm. I think that day we actually made headway of about 100 nautical miles only because of the severe weather. I suppose it means different things to different people, but for me, I made a lot of friends while I was in the Navy, and acquaintances. We get together regularly, many of us, and we have what we affectionately call larrikins lunches, and we'll swap stories. It just keeps the friendships alive, it keeps the bond there, and we all have a bond. I suppose when I joined the Navy, I was told that loyalty goes two ways, it goes up and down, and that was drilled into me at an early age in the Navy. I guess my coming from a naval background and naval family, that was always part of it as well. So that after I left the Navy, I thought, well, I haven't actually been to war. I haven't seen a conflict. Fortunately, that my whole 30-year span in the Navy was during a period of relative peace, and I missed the Vietnam era. So that and then I started to realise that many young soldiers, sailors and airmen who had been to war were having some form of difficulty when they came back. So I decided that I wanted to try to do something about that. So I had already been a member of the Defence Force Welfare Association, and I started to become active in Perth here, and it wasn't long before one of my mates dobbed me in to become president. And I've been president for many years now. It's a role I enjoy. I enjoy helping others and working with others.